piece left over is.
No piece left over.
Hey, what do you know? We're gonna print something?
She said that.
Hey, Dan.
Document. Today, which we did print and the expense account was and we looked at it, was unreasonable. So I got that report and I went to the bank and found out. And he spent
I know what he's talking about.
I'll get him.
Yeah, I know that's not.
Ultra grade over here on this screen.
That's where the Windsboro and the Sons are there. Okay, what, I could not come up with the full Sons name.
Family, where's my family? There? Come on, we're gonna get the book.
Look at that one. Look at here. Big rock. Yeah, another big one. Thank you. Thank you. Yep. You got the bigger one.
Is the predecessor to the Lebanon church that is in Winnsboro that they still worship at today. I don't know who preached here. I know that Gladney did preach at Salem Church, which is a sister church to this one.
Anybody know about the spire here?
1775.
Who's in the shade pretty good?
Do you know anything about that?
That one? Yeah. I don't, but I took a picture of the part that came on.
to get this thing visible and to start on the restoration project, they want to put some stones down in that thing. They want to get some more stones. But he said this is Buddy said, yeah, this was the glass.
My great-grandfather's brother was so when two of his brothers were in the Civil War.
The whole.
Thought they was doing one table.
It's at their very first reunion ever.
Alright. First reunion? Oh, no.
Stand up, please, and introduce yourself.
I'm Rossell Adams Beckett, and I've been through the Gladneys through my great-great-grandmother who married James Kennard Adams. She was Mary Frances Gladney.
Mary Elizabeth.
Mary Elizabeth Gladney.
And then she was your great-grandmother, not your great-great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother.
I'm already standing, so I live with a little boy. This is Lucas. I'm Ken Kirkpatrick. This is my wife, Fatima. And my great-great-grandmother was Harriet. Great-grandmother was Harriet Gladney. It's a pleasure to be here. My wife is originally from Turkey, and she's been in this country with me now for about 3 years. So she's probably traveled the furthest of anybody to get here.
You win.
This is Lucas.
Hi, baby.
Yeah, he's 2.5 and loves cameras and everything else that mommy and daddy do.
And granddaddy. He loves granddaddy too.
Tonight. Don't be surprised.
You know what I'm wondering, is you?
My name's Kathy Adams Jenkins. I am descended through Mary Elizabeth Gladney, who married James Kennard Gladney, Adams. My father's name was Lewis Adams. We're from Hurd County, Georgia. That's where we originated from. And he was always very proud of his Gladney grandmother and his Gladney relatives. And she was a little bitty, teeny tiny woman with sort of auburn red hair and freckles. And when I was a child, my hair was a lot more red and I had a lot more freckles. And when I'd cry about being so homely, he'd say, "You're not, you look like your grandmama Gladney."
I mentioned that this is the 35th anniversary of the reunion. Is there anybody here that was at the very first reunion in 1976?
Yeah, wow.
Stand up. Stand up.
Where was it?
It was down at the,
Just the Ed Stevens house?
yeah, well, yeah, we ate
went
it.
there.
But it was down at the little
Lamppost.
lamppost in the back room there. Mrs. Arnold's 88th birthday.
How about that?
And, but ate out at Ed Stevenson's house. He cooked steaks outside for her. It was his beef too that he had
How about that?
slaughtered.
They had a,
There was 140 people at that reunion.
they had a money tree.
Pam Gladney.
Yeah, I'm sorry. They had a money tree for Mrs. Arnold that put 88 $1 bills on it.
Oh.
Each year she was over.
Pam Gladney, stand up. Thank you, my dear, for helping us set up today. You did not have to do that, and I appreciate your help. Of course you have to do that. Your family. And thank you to Judy Whitesell and her whole family for providing the food tonight, last night. We'll get on to the business of tonight. Mr. Dan Gladney will read the minutes from the last meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, family. You notice I didn't say and. I never
Yes.
could understand that why you say family.
Friends and family.
So we're all together. It's good to see you. Good to see you. And yes, Dudley, I had my share of the chicken tonight. Thank you very much. I noticed you kept count how many times I kept going back.
What did you
My
say?
pilot friend over there, Longview, Texas. You gotta be kidding me.
Speaking to the mic, we're hearing you now.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Gotcha. How's that? Is that okay? Good. Gladney's America Business Meeting, year 2010, in Union, Georgia. Gladney's America Association Business Meeting and Banquet was held on July the 24th, 2010 in the conference room of the Country Inn and Suites in Union, Georgia. Arranged by Kathy. C. Wallace Gladney, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, President, opened the banquet with a hearty welcome to all and with prayer. Individual family member introductions was made by each family after the banquet meal. C. Wallace gave a brief history of the Gladney's arrival in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Gladney acceptance of the land grants from the King of England. Wally also spoke of the incorporation of the association and the publication of the association book by author Mildred Gladney Arnold and her husband, publisher Tom. Announcements was made that the association's softcover books, the red books, remain for sale at $25 each. Terry Gladney of Buckheimer, Missouri, was the new 3-year director for that. Kathy Newman was introduced as the Gladneys in America president for 2010-2012. The board of directors and officers for the 2010-2011 was presented at the meeting. At that time, the meeting was adjourned approximately 8 p.m. on the 24th of July. Kathy has asked me to give you the new slate of officers for the coming year. The Lucille Gladney remains the director 2009 to 2012. Gladney Brooks, director 2011 term has expired. Terry Berkheimer from Missouri. Terry Berkheimer. Excuse me. It's a southern thing. Thank you. Terry has graciously accepted to take over the position of vice president for 2011-2012. That office was vacated by Kevin Beach, who due to job and family had to remove himself from that position. So Terry is taking over that position. In that position for the coming year, we have one. Connie, where are you at? Here you go, right here. Connie Adams has accepted to fulfill Terry's directorship, which would be in a 2010 to 2013, 2 years on that directorship. Thank you.
Thank you,
Let's see, we now have Kathy Newman will remain as president and editor of the Gladney Gram. I mentioned that to you. Tim Johnson.
Stand up, Tim.
Here. Tim will remain and has been for a number of years our database manager and does a great job with that. Thank you. C. Wallace Gladney will remain treasurer and is also a past president. Wally Gladney from Lexington will remain historian and is a past president. I will remain as secretary and as past president. Madam President, it's okay if I announce. I was expecting to have more of our past presidents at the board of directors meeting tonight. All the past presidents are invited. We desire your input, your thoughts. The past presidents are not voting members of the board, only the current board are, but it's always welcome to have their experience and their past expertise there. That concludes my reading of the minutes of the last business meeting and of the new current officers. Will there be anything else?
Sir, thank you so much.
Encore.
And we will continue to pay Mr. Patrick for his wonderful job that he does on keeping our cemetery maintained. He did an excellent job this year. He's worked so hard out in the hot sun. We thank you. That will remain at $500 per year for that. And we've also asked him to take care of another little glitch that came along in the cemetery when they cleared an area to the side of the cemetery. The edging fell over, And I don't think it's on our deeded property anymore. So he's going to, when it gets cooler, he's going to put those large granite pillars back in place and edge the cemetery.
Those things have been down for years, since I've been taking care of cemetery. The bulldozing work did
Oh, it
not
didn't
knock
do
them
that?
over. No,
Okay.
they've been down. But I would be glad to attend to proceed on how to fix that, how to restore it, just like the front when you walk in, it's the coping and the border around there with we can see, because it seems to be all there.
And that is Winnsboro blue granite.
That's right. We passed that quarry, you know, the short curve when we went to the old church back over there, the beautiful old church across the river creek. And that sharp curve coming back is the little Baptist church sign. Well, that quarry, one of those quarries is back in there, which you can actually drive in there and look at the rocks. I mean, it's a big old pile of the mountain things, but I don't get it. They did not have it fenced off years ago, so anybody that's curious about the actual site of some of that blue granite would be worth going by there.
And they do not quarry that anymore. I asked around to see if I could buy some. You can't buy it here. They don't sell it.
You could, well, you're probably right, but you can also inquire as to how we could, if anybody wanted some blocks of it, there's got to be some way, I don't know, if they don't sell it anymore as a business, as long as someone supervised you getting it and you didn't take it like a commercial venture out of it, you know, that I can help.
Actually, it's on, the lady that's owned it has fenced it off because they have liability problems and they try to keep people out, but there are teenagers that get in there and swim and do lots of graffiti and stuff. There was a stockpile that a person bought, he was selling some for business purposes, and he died. I'm not sure what's left of the marketable, but Phillips Granite Company takes care of all the monuments around here, and they are the knowledgeable ones. If you want to contact me,
Thank you. Phillips Granite, thank you.
Right.
Good discussion, thank you.
So is there any more business? Our presentation tonight is going to be on the history of Winnsboro and Fairfield County. And it's presented by Ms. Helen Lyles in the pink shirt over here. And she's the director of the Fairfield County Museum. And Mr. Val Green, infrastructure consultant. He's a consultant, yeah, I know. So I'll give the floor to you.
Well, I'll introduce him a little bit, but he didn't want me to tell. He also has Gladney connections, so he's going to fill you in on that. My ancestors were, believe it or not, it's said to be the first white child born in Fairfield County was my fourth great grandfather, but nobody was running around with books in those days, so I don't know how they ever came up with that. Anyway, that's what it said. And his father was scalped on the Broad River, so they were here really, really early. They were English settlers who came down from Virginia, and I don't know why, but they didn't seem to marry any Presbyterians. I don't have any Gladney blood, or except my father married a good Presbyterian Scot, so I do have good Scotch-Irish in me too. But I want to introduce Val. Val, you'll notice he's sort of Native American looking. He's a throwback. He has two brothers who look as Scotch-Irish as you and me, and they're Aikens, and they definitely, they make fun of him because he always talks about his Indian heritage. But his grandmother said, "You're my Indian grandson," and he definitely knows his stuff. So I'm always glad to have him speak. I don't do as good of a job, and he knows the business a whole lot better than I do. I have a very curious story to tell you after he finishes speaking. He wouldn't let me tell you before because he thinks it's crazy, but it's a Gladney story that you probably don't know and have never heard. I'm going to save it and surprise you, so don't go away at the end. Thanks. This is Val Green.
My mother was an Aiken, and my grandfather was Wade Aiken, Wade Milton Aiken. His father was James Aiken, and my great-grandfather's twin sister was Caroline Aiken, who married Franklin Bunyan Gladney, I think.
Davis can't get it straight either, but I think we're right on that, close. But if any of y'all are related to, through him, hello cousins. And when I was a boy, their son, Frank Gladney, was an older fellow, and I was a weak tyke, and Granddaddy had a pickup that would come out to the farm every day, and I'd come with him, and there'd be 4 people in that truck. Granddaddy was driving, Frank Gladney was sitting in the middle, and my uncle Doug Aiken was sitting on the outside, and I was a little fellow, I'd sit in his lap. And when it came time to open the wire gap for the cows, I always jumped out, and I thought that was a big job. But I'll tell you, I never rode around with Uncle Doug and Frank Gladney that they didn't argue. They argued all the time. One of them would say something was black up and an open swine. And that went on for all my life. I remember it. Anyhow, what I thought I would do right quick, y'all, I don't know the Gladney history, y'all had it last year, I understand, but I took a little bit of it. But I want to just tell you a little bit about how this community out here developed from time zero, almost, first humans in this area. The first humans were the native people here, and we got really good evidence that these people were here about 12,000 or more years ago. You know, if you're a southern kid, I know you've gone out and picked up airplanes. Is I'm sounding up too much, too little?
No, too little.
Can you hear me?
No.
No?
No.
Cut it up. Cut it up. No. Too much?
No, that's wonderful.
That good? Okay, all right. Anyhow, every southern boy went and picked up airpoints, I'm sure. And unbeknownst to us at that time, those points, some of them were 10,000 years old, 8,000 years old. So we call the earliest native people here, we call them the paleo people, and they were big game hunters. They hunted buffalo, they hunted elk, they hunted bison, they hunted a bunch of other animals which became extinct due to some geological incidents some 10,000, 12,000 years ago, I believe. And so these paleo people were here till about 8,000 years ago, and then they were replaced, actually it was probably the same people, they were replaced by people we call the archaic people. And this is a period of time beginning about 8,000 years ago and lasting up to around 4,000 years ago. So we had a long period of time in there. And most of the little points that we found, we always call arrow points. They're not arrow points. They came off the end of a spear or a knife or what you call an addle. So anyhow, a throwing stick. And they were hunting a lot of big game animals too, of course. Beginning around 3,500 years ago, native people in the southeast settled down to a little bit more of a sedentary lifestyle, if you will. They began to collect a lot of plants and plant things, so they had, if you want, not quite gardens, but places where they collected the plants, and they went to the point of going to these areas as they moved around seasonally where the food supplies were there. They were still hunters, of course. And these folks were called the woodland folks. And they lasted till about 1,000 years ago. And about 1,000 years ago, native people really went haywire in the southeastern United States, whereas before there had been almost what we call today a true democracy of government and culture. They elected themselves a king, basically, and they built a big old platform for them to live on, and we call those Indian mounds, right? Well, we have Indian mounds here in Fairfield County, one at least for sure. And it's over here on Broad River, and it's this area that I'm going to tell you about. Now, does everybody know the geography of Fairfield County very well? No, I guess we'll live around here. Fairfield County was settled in the western area out this way and in the eastern area about the same time. But I'm mostly going to talk about the western area out here. This is the Broad River out here, Winnsboro right in the middle, and the Blair Mountain. And what I'm going to talk about is right in this area right here.
Which is where my ancestor was scouted, right at.
And y'all's family, I believe, settled on Jackson Creek. Is that not right?
Yeah.
Jackson Creek. His name was Joseph Gladney. Is that the first one? Richard. Okay. All right, anyhow, that's not far. What I'm talking about here, and Jackson Creek is right about here. So you're close. All these people are close. And,
You can disconnect that if you want to.
ma'am?
You can disconnect that mic.
Is it too much?
No, you can
No, when you
disconnect
walk
it,
away.
tear it around with it.
I'm not going to around. I'm not a preacher. These people were very interesting because they built mounds. They elected a king they called a sun god. They had a hierarchy of rulers, and below those they had priests, or you will, or elders on the day. And then they had artisans, people that you probably made a lot of points and things, you found a lot of other things too. And then on the bottom, they had to work for bees. And believe it or not, they call these people, and this word came to us through the French, they call these people stinkers. But just like today, if you're a stinker, if you're married right, you can move up. A stinker can move up by marrying into the royal family. So, and the sun god's sons could not inherit, but his sister's son. It's had a very complicated history in society. And that society lasted until the Europeans arrived. And as far as the interior of South Carolina goes, we know that the first Europeans in this area were the Spanish under one of the conquistadors named Hernando de Soto. De Soto came to South Carolina in 1540. He had an army of 600 people, 200 of them riding horses. He had 200 pigs or so with him. You know, had a real huge group of people. And he came up through Georgia, Florida, Georgia, and into South Carolina. And he was looking for gold because De Soto had been with Pizarro in the Andes when they conquered Peru and the Inca down there. So De Soto was looking for gold. And he came all the way through his country. He ended up on the Mississippi River where he died, and some of his people made it back to Mexico City. And from those survivors, we have at least 4 good stories of De Soto's trip. So that's where all that information comes from. So it's reasonably accurate stuff. And in South Carolina, De Soto was looking for a big town, a place where all the gold was, the king was, and had all the gold, what he viewed, because that's where it was in Peru. And he came to a town called Copetacheki. It's a long, corrupted Spanish Creek Indian word, and don't worry how to spell it. But this town had the people who were the principal native people of South Carolina, the interior of South Carolina, and they apparently ruled an area through the interior of South Carolina, most of the way to the Savannah River, most of the way to North Carolina, this direction, and all the way into North Carolina and north of here. So they were a powerful group of native people. Strangely enough, a woman was the top dog there. And a young woman came out to meet De Soto, and she was all dressed in white buckskins, and they said she was the most gorgeous thing they'd ever seen, you know, and De Soto exchanged, she gave him a thing of pearls, and he gave her a ring, so it was honky-dory, till they got across the river into where the town was, and soon after that, he put her in chains and took her a prisoner, because these people, they were looking for gold, he didn't find gold, he went on north into North Carolina. But these mound building people had this central empire in South Carolina, and the other areas out across the 2 states were part of their culture and part of their empire. And we call these people mound building people. Now, when did this start? A lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from this book right here, which, by the way, Paul and I redid 2 years ago, where we saw them for $42.
History of the
My slides don't follow exactly, but
Technology is bad. Right here.
yeah. But anyhow, a lot of what I'll talk about right now comes from this book, and this book is this early history written by a man in 1859, published in 1859, called John Henry Logan. He talked about what this countryside was like. It was not full of pine trees. There may have been a few pine trees here, but there weren't many pine trees here. It was mostly an open prairie. They had prairie grass that grew as high as a horse's back. They had what's called a wild pea vine growing everywhere. Down in the creeks, instead of it being big, tall, what we call bottomland hardwood trees now, it was primarily cane brakes. So the picture of this country at that time was much different than what it is today. And John Henry Logan tells a lot of stories about what your ancestors saw when you first got here. I'll guarantee you that when they first saw Jackson Creek over here, it was probably one huge cane brake. Of course, cane will burn well into the water. Yeah, that's what we found and got here. Elk were here, buffalo were here. I guess y'all know that kind of stuff. We had a lot of big animals here. All right, here's a shot of what these people look like at Copetacheki, the mound building people that were a part of this Indian society. There's the existing mound. as an existing mound down on Santee Lake, where I-95 crosses the Santee is just north of there. And this is the place where I believe this great big town of Petticheke was at the Southern Business School. They also lived in underground, believe it or not, they lived in underground shelters in the wintertime. They weren't foolish to live outside in this bad weather. They built basically an underground shelter. And one of them survives over here at Okmulgee out of Macon, Georgia. They rebuilt one on the site over there. You can see them over there. It's the same thing they were all here in the Southeast. We know to hear out of descriptions of them. So, kind of interesting. These people they didn't live like Hollywood always taught us to live. No such PTs on. All right. The Spanish came through in 1540. Again, the Spanish came through in 1567. The Spanish came through again in 1567, and then some years after that, they abandoned South Carolina. They had Santa Helena down there, where's Paris Island today, where the North American headquarters were. They disappeared, and in 1670, the English settled Charleston, of course. And one of the first things that the people that came here did to make money, cash money, was to trade deer skins and other animal fur for European goods and trinkets. And many people, many Carolinians made their first money doing this. It was really only cash crop. You couldn't get away from Charleston very far and raise a crop and get it to market. There were no roads, mostly rivers to get transportation. So having a cash crop, if you lived anywhere within more than 10 miles over Charleston, you couldn't get it to market. So it was deer skins that made a lot of the early fortunes of early Carolina settlers. And this prospered right on up until the Revolutionary War. Now, in the interior of South Carolina, and up in our area out here, there wasn't a lot of contact with the native people early on, but I know that sometime at the beginning, about 1650 or so, the Virginians were beginning, from Jamestown, were beginning to come down into South Carolina, mostly up around Charlotte and down to the Waterway River, trading deerskins with native people. But people out of Charleston were a little bit later doing that, and these two groups conflicted along maybe 10 or 15 years after Charleston was founded. But by 1700, Charleston had been there 30 years now. The hierarchy of the state of South Carolina was in Charleston, and the few people that were living out of Charleston had not gone more than 50 miles up into the interior, except for a few isolated cases of folks coming on up there for other reasons, looking for gold and other valuable things, and also looking to see what kind of land was there. Were explorers mainly, and traders, some Indian traders, of course. But the big thing that got started in the early 1700s in South Carolina is cattle raising. It was done right from the start, but they got so the wealthier people started raising a lot of cows. They had the whole state, it was their pasture, right? And they found out that the area up here was great cattle country because it was a lot of grassland. But whereas the low country, there's always been trees down there. So they drove cattle herds up into the interior here in the upcountry. And then in the fall of the year, when the calves were fat, the cows were ready for market, they actually drove these cows to Philadelphia. So we had the first cattle drives. Y'all from Texas? We beat you by 100 years. We beat you by 100 years in cattle drives. We did 700 miles to Philadelphia, and they were driving herds of cattle to Philadelphia in the early 1700s from the upcountry of South Carolina. And hence the name cow pens came in up here. The cow pens were the places where they would hem the animals up at night, presumably to keep the wolves and the rest of the beasts and the native people and whoever else from stealing their cows. And so all over the state of South Carolina, we had cow pens, which was the one very famous where the battle was up here. But raising cows was an early business here, along with deerskin trade. Now, in 1711, there started this thing we call the Indian Wars in South Carolina. And at that time, from then, 1711 to about 1720, nearly every group of native people in South and North Carolina got involved in one way or the other with fighting. Most of them were against the colonists, but a few of them were with the colonists on their side. When it was all over in 1720, most of the native people of South Carolina had been displaced, pushed around, sold into slavery, or were dead. And the groups that coalesced or left here coalesced together in small groups. The Catawba up here in Lancaster County was one of the groups. There's a lot of native people coalesced with them, and there were some 25 or 30 languages spoken by the time of the Revolution in that particular towns up there. But it displaced a bunch of other native people that came from North Carolina and scattered down into South Carolina. And the one group is well known as part of our history right here were the Inno people from Hillsborough, North Carolina. Everybody familiar with North Carolina about Hillsborough? It's northeast of here, not too far from Durham and Raleigh and over that way. And the Inno people lived right there. And they were on they had lived on the old trading path that came from Virginia all the way down to the Carolinas. They call it the Okeechee Path. But they were right in the middle. So they were getting beat on from both directions during the Indian War period. So they just got out of Dodge. And they came down to Fairfield County. And they settled out here where the Blair Mound is, out here in Blair, and across the river where the Inno-Ree River comes in, and hence that's where we get the name of that river. Inno-Ree, they were Inno people, and Ree, R-E-E, is the suffix of the Siouan language, which is the language they spoke, for river. So they became people of the river. Inno-Ree was for the Inno people that lived there. And they were in the business down here of trading skins, of hunting animals and trading skins, just like they were back there. And from those people's presence, there came some people out of Virginia to settle this area and to trade with these native people. And as far as we know, her family were some of the earlier ones, the Lyles. They came to what we call Lyles Ford, which is right on the Broad River, right where the Inno comes in, right above us, slightly there. And other groups came down out of Virginia to trade. The famous old guy, Hans Wagner, everybody's kin to the Wagners here. Oh, all right, there's his house. They recreated this up at Wachovia, which is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He was a miller from Virginia. And he came down here during the off season when he wasn't milling wheat. He came down here and trapped to trade, and he eventually came to live down here. But he built a house in Wachovia, which when the Wachovia settlers got there some 30, 40 years later, they found the ruins of his house. So the first settlers, the first white settlers into this part of Fairfield County came from Virginia. And very shortly after that, the settlers began to come up from Columbia, up the Broad River. They were people who had settled and land granted around Fort Granby down there, which was originally Indian trading post. It was set up in 1719. And it was from there the colonials, the British government, of course, stopped that fort with soldiers, and it became the trading hub for the Broad River and the area north and west of here, mostly with the Cherokee people, but some with the Sioux, with the Catawbas. By the way, the people of central South Carolina speak the Sioux language. Same people that Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull speak in, same language they speak out there. And that's a whole long story, but we just speak that language. So this trading developed from Fort Granby here, and some of those people moved up into here. And in Logan's book, he talks about the early settlers that came up here and saw the big herds of buffalo on Little River and saw the elk, and he talks about the last man that killed the last elk here, named Robert Newton, and Mr. Newton was what he called a Nimrod. He was made a living with a gun. He shot the last elk. He gave the horns to and hams to Mr. Pearson family from out here on Broad River. Said Mr. Pearson ate the hams and sent the horns to a museum in England. So, yeah, that was in, and that was occurring around 1735, 1740, that time period. And the very earliest Europeans were in here. The Inno people that came down here from North Carolina settled, and they apparently stayed around. When they excavated this mound down here in Blair, when in South Carolina, they excavated the mound. They found a continuous, okay, that's Lyles Ford. Sorry about the slide, I can't do both of these. That's on the Broad River right there, where the ford was laid. It's very close to the mound. All this is pretty close together. And these Inno people came here, settled around the fort, and apparently stayed. And they became the kind of hangs around the fort people, if you will, what we used to call the Sioux people out west. and they were acted as bearers and, you know, did odd jobs for the Europeans and stuff, the traders that were here. And the crosses between Indian blood and white blood and black blood in Fairfield County came primarily from these people coming down in here. Believe me, there are lots of them. I ain't the only one in here. All right, okay. She keeps pushing her Lyles group here. And, that's an old plat we have of the Lyles Ford and some of the land grants there. And on that plat, if you look real close, you can see a path to the Catawbas that's written there. So they were trading back with the Catawbas, which are in the, you know, way up near Charlotte. What's the other? Anyhow, these Inno people were here and they stayed here, and they some of them lived in, some of them married white people who grew up, some black people, and they became the local Indians, and the group, the town where these people live, separate from the white settlements here, maybe half a mile down the road, became known as Buckhead. And if anybody is from Atlanta, anybody here from Atlanta? You know about Buckhead, Betty's in Atlanta? Well, the term Buckhead, you know, the term Buckhead in Atlanta has the same origin. All across the South, the term Buckhead is really a slang term for an Indian community living close to white people. And the place out where we live out there today is still called Buckhead out there. And these Indian people were there, and they eventually just were absorbed into the white family, some of them, I guess. But anyway, Buckhead's our name of the road out there, name of our area, and it appears on historic maps. About far back as we have maps. So that went on up until the late or middle 1700s, and then the settlement the settlers who were coming in here, some came from Charleston, as I said, some came up from Virginia, some came up from the Broad River who were originally Charleston settlers, some came down from Virginia, and then around 1753, and those, I think about 1750 to 1760, Cowpens. 1750 to 1760, the Scots-Irish started coming in here. Now, I'm glad these are Scots-Irish, right? Okay. Do you know what year did y'all first get here? Anybody know that?
What?
1769.
When?
1769.
69, okay, that's close. All right. We had some earlier people that came in from Wachovia that were from that group. The Frees, the Owens, and those, actually they were dumpers, called dumpers, and because they baptized people by dumping them in the water, dumpers, they came in about 1764, and they settled on Lucas's Creek and up on some little river there. But then the Scotch-Irish people started coming in, and we know that the Stone Church, everybody seen the Stone Church? The Stone Church was not the first church that was built for the Scots-Irish people. There was an earlier church on the south side of Creek, Jackson Creek, right? And there's a graveyard in there. Have you all been to that graveyard?
Yeah.
Have you been to that graveyard? Yeah, not me. It's back off the road almost a mile. You walk in there. But then the first church was over that side, and then the second church was where it is, where the Stone Church is today. And that church wasn't built until 1802.
I was earlier than that,
Huh?
1780s.
Well, I can't remember. A man named Russell built it, right?
1782.
And
It
he
was
built it,
1780s.
apparently built the stone
1780s.
house, which became the manse also by that same time. Well, the Scots-Irish were well established by then. But there's a real interesting little book that talks and gives us a little bit of information about the earliest of the Scots-Irish on Jackson Creek. And the man's name was Woodmason. And Charles Woodmason. And Woodmason came to this country and settled in Georgetown County, became a planter, and then he got the faith. He went back to England and got ordained, and he came back to the interior of South Carolina, and he traveled in the interior of South Carolina for about maybe 6 to 8 years. And during that time, he preached all up and down the Wateree River and came over as far as over to the east as far as the Lynchburg River and to the west as far as the Broad River. And he later wrote a book called The Country of South Carolina on the Interior. On the interior. on the eve of the revolution, excuse me, thank you. And in that book, he tells some hilarious tales about your ancestors, because he saw them. And I realized this guy was an Anglican minister, and he was encountering Scots-Irish people, right? They didn't get along at all. They didn't like him, but they were curious enough to go. And see, when he would announce he was coming to preach at some place, he'd have a full house. And everybody would show up, and their family come, and they'd be dragging all the children along and everything. It was pretty rowdy things. One time he was preaching somewhere near Camden, and the Scotch-Irish folks there had him before around there. They were going to fix him good. So they brought a pack of dogs with them. And they ran the dogs down the middle of the church, right in the middle of the barking dogs down the middle of the church, right in the middle of the service. And the next time Wood Mason printed his bulletin up and put it on some door of the church where he was going to be there to preach in the future, he put a little note in it that said, "Bring no dogs with you." It's a pretty funny story. It's good. It's good. Good reading about
He
it.
actually accused them of bringing their congregational members, the dogs from congregational members.
It's pretty funny reading. And he's really a pompous kind of English fellow. But he talks about preaching at he uses the term, the Little River Church in 1767. So we know for sure that what is now the Lebanon Church, what was originally that church, was here in 1767. Now, whether it was a building or not, I don't know. But he used the term Little River Church in 1767 to preach. He came back the next year in 1768 and he preached again at that place, and he used a different term for that. I don't know what we call it, the Jackson Creek Church the second time. So he used a different name, and whether that name was started that year or was originally the name before, and exactly the date of that church, I don't know, but I would guess it's somewhere around 1765. It almost certainly has to be, because we know that the Dumpers came to church. Dumpers came to church, so he talks about those people coming to church, and he talks about the Scots-Irish people. So your ancestors were here, I guess they were here, if not in time for Mr. Wood Mason's wife after that. We came in 1769, and that's the origin of your family, my family. My Aikens were here. They were very late. They didn't come until after the Revolutionary War. But that's a settlement pattern for this part of South Carolina, and it's really interesting. We got a lot of history. We got people that came down through the beginning. Let's see, the wagon road began when? What's the beginning of the wagon road?
But I just passed.
The Great Wagon Road, the same route that the cow drivers had followed to Philadelphia, the people began, the immigrants coming into, there it is, okay. That's the route. The immigrants coming into Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was the port of entry, came down that road looking for free land. And it became the greatest highway in North America at the time, and it came right through western Fairfield County. And we have some slides on there to depict it a little bit. And right now, I can't come up with the date at the beginning. You can bet it was about 10 or 20 years before the Revolutionary War, people began to come down. And the war slowed that traffic down to nothing, of course. And then after the war, it picked up considerably, and by 1800 or so, somebody noted that there were 1,000 wagons a month coming down that road. So in that time, that was a huge amount of traffic on that highway. This is a cut. If you're over at Little River, right near Lyles Ford over there, this is a place we found where this is a cut into the banks. It's heading into Broad River there. It's about, I guess, 10 feet deep and just barely wide enough for a wagon to get through there. And that's the pure evidence of where that wagon road came through here. And all of y'all's ancestors, and some of mine, and some of everybody else that inhabits Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas came down that road, and some of them stayed here, some of them went on west, some of them stayed here for one generation, the next generation went on west, and the entire southern United States was populated by basically the same people. Now, there were some other groups that came in, like some of the Germans in Texas and stuff, but for the most part, you and I have cousins all the way from here to Texas. And as we say here in South Carolina, you know, if you walk down the streets of Columbia and you spit, you would hit a cousin.
That's right.
That's pretty darn close to the truth. So we're all kin because of the way we settle this country and the way we pretty much marry into the same groups of people, mainly because there wasn't anybody else to marry.
That's right.
We didn't marry your neighbors or any other people around.
That's right.
Gladney.
Okay.
It's Gladney. This is 1820 map. I know you've seen the Robert Mills map. You see the Johnson's store is the stone house that you see on the road there. It was at one time Johnson's store. We have found the ruins of Captain Buchanan's house, which is on Jackson Creek, but it's back in the woods, and it was a stone dwelling also, torn down in the 1950s or 60s, sadly, but we got pictures of it. But anyway, these were all your neighbors that should occur in your deeds and things. I know the Gladneys pretty well moved out early, but some of the names, Evans, I think you have Evans married into the family. Winns, possibly, Akins, you do, Martins. That's your neighborhood there.
I did. Something else, there were a lot of land grants on Little River, Jackson Creek and Little River for people who were purely land speculators. You see names on there that you don't see any sign up here anymore. Because these people come up and buy a piece of land and turn around and sell it the next week. They're just making a buck on it. So that happened a lot up here because of the availability of property. That was just the case where it is. I want to talk 30 minutes at least. So.
Well, can we go through your slides and see what you missed?
Yeah, I probably missed one. Go that way. All right, this is just a crossing of the river to on flat boats. The river's not very deep. But most of the time, it's not deep enough to float a boat on because of the rocks in it.
Which river is that?
The Broad River, straight out here.
These are artifacts that were taken from what we believe was Fort Wagner. We talked about Hans Wagner, the German
Hans
who
Wagner,
came here.
the
He
first later
fortified several people. The Louses also had a fort. They would take a log house and thicken up the walls and maybe dig a trench out in front to protect them from the Indians. And we were always told that my ancestors kept a canoe in a dry trench near their house that they could quickly push out into Beaver Creek, which flowed into the river there, to get away from the Indians if they had to. But obviously one of them didn't make it. He got scalped. We're trying to find the exact location, and so far this is the closest indication that we may have found out where this fort was.
That's the Marsh cabin.
Yes.
This is the Marsh cabin, one of the early cabins. We still got a fair number of these old cabins around here. Is there a picture of Little Egypt in there?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. This is called Little Egypt. This is out here on Highway 215, about 4 miles north of Salem Crossroads. It's still there. It belonged to my family for a while. They rented it. I'm not sure which. The Crowders, my grandmother's family, the Crowders. And I can picture them in about 1895 standing out in front of the house there. That's it right there. These are my great-great-grandparents right here. Anyhow, so there's a good many cabins around here. Were original cabins of this area. And of course, they're all log-built cabins and crudely built cabins for the most part. And then they would come in, they would add siding to them, and they would put a second story on them and that sort of thing. And some of them somehow have survived. Not too often, maybe a bit of France, maybe a dozen. That's another People's family cabin around over there near Broad called Indian Trail. Well, that's Woodmason's book. If you want a little humor, talking about your ancestors walking around in petticoats.
I would like to see the front of
That's the title of it.
The Carolina Backcountry, I would really miss the heck out of that.
If you go on Amazon, they
You
reprinted it so many times.
can get this book pretty cheap on eBay or something like that. It's funny. So he was definitely very against most of these folks because they were different religions. He ended up going back to England because they ran him out of the country just before the Revolutionary War.
story. You want to read it? That's the fun one. And
That's the
we
stone
all know
church.
where that is. That's where
That's the stone church. That's the same map we have there. That's the Lemon family?
Yeah.
That's the Lemon family, the house on 213? Those? Okay, that's the Lemon family, that house is still standing, and been redone, very nice looking place.
That's it.
Okay, that's all we got. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I promised.
Tell him, he was mentioning the fact that in the 1760s, there was growth in the number of Scots-Irish that came over. One of the reasons why is the Bounty Act of 1762. That was one of the reasons why.
They were trying to get those settlers here.
Yeah, they were trying to form a buffer between the Indians and the settlers on the coast. And they figured the more people they had in here, the more people they could have killed.
That's part of the township plan. They built townships in the interior, it's all part of the same thing.
Right.
They built them at Augusta, in Orangeburg, called Amelia. They built one at Kingsborough, near Conway, Camden, Fredericksburg, was called Fredericksburg. That was populated very well up there. And these would be these guys were the buffer between the Indians and the Charlestonians. They were the sacrificial lambs, but the Indians hit them first. Well, that kind of really never happened. A little bit, but not much.
Well, the Indians were being decimated by disease.
The Indian Wars were over in 1720. There was not much left, not much fight left.
But that was one of the reasons why there were so many, because they were offering the free passage in exchange for for land. So.
If y'all will stay in touch with me, I've got my email address. I have a friend who is descended from an early family here out in Missouri, is putting together a land plat atlas where all of the colonial plats will be set up so you can see it. He's got it partially finished. Gladney's are not on it. I wanted him to send me something real quick for the speech, but he hasn't placed that part of the county yet. But as soon as he gets it up and running, or I can send you his website address and you can kind of keep up with what he's doing.
Now, is he going to sell that, or is that going to be?
No, he's going to have it available digitally online. You search it online, which is a wonderful thing. That's what I love about historians. They want to share everything, because you share something, and that's what I find in doing museum work. Somebody comes in thinking they're going to get information from me, and usually they leave great globs of information for me to put into other people's folders and try to understand this puzzle of these people that came and went and came back in some cases too. We had some members of my family who went to Mississippi and didn't do it and ended up coming back and starting over again. But the population of America is a wonderful thing. I like the melting pot idea a lot. I want to read you this letter, and you can take it with a grain of salt. You can look at me and think I'm crazy, or you can just laugh at it if you like. Back at Christmas, two ladies came in from Pennsylvania and Virginia traveling. They were reenactors, and they were coming to Charleston for one of the Civil War reenactments that were going on at that time. And they walked in and said they wanted to see the Gladney history. And I said, oh, you're Gladney cousins. We have the reunion coming this year. And they said, well, not exactly. And so I spent a good bit of time talking to them. You know, I am a bit gullible, I suppose, but I think these ladies were pretty honest. They were middle-aged, and this is what Janet wrote me. I contacted Janet last week to tell her that the reunion was coming on, and that I would like to tell her story and see if there was any input, if you could help her with her story. She says, "Hi, Pelham, so great to hear from you. Visiting you in the museum was a big highlight of my trip to South Carolina. You were so accommodating and friendly. I'm so excited to hear about the reunion. Thank you for your offer to relay information and ask questions. My connection to Amos Gladney, crazy as it sounds, is that I believe I was Amos. I was raised as a Christian and taught not to believe in reincarnation, and never did, until a little over 10 years ago when I took my first trip to Gettysburg. After a series of trips there filled with déjà vu and flashbacks, I came to the conclusion I had been a 17-year-old Confederate soldier who was killed there. Over time, more and more information came back to me. I knew my name was Amos, and I knew the location on the battlefield where I was shot. I knew I'd been buried by an older man in my unit who was also a family friend who had watched over me. He buried me in a wooded area. All this stuff, I just knew. That's the best I can explain it. I and some of my friends began researching, trying to find out if there had been a 17-year-old rebel boy named Amos killed in Gettysburg. We found the book, Gettysburg's Confederate Dead by Gregory Coco. Reading it cover to cover, we found Amos J. Gladney, 17 years old, Company E, 15th South Carolina. The book says he died July the 3rd, but that has to be a typo. He died on July the 2nd, and I knew that already. It says he was buried on George Rose's farm in the woods. His headboard was present, but no grave, and this was submitted by a man named Ambrose Emery. It went on to say that the possible location of his remains were possibly in one of 15 boxes marked L to the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond in September of 1872 as an unknown. I guess they were moving some of the graves from the battlefield at that time. My intuition tells me Amos's remains were never recovered. What is left of him, if anything, is still there in the Gettysburg Rose Woods. Going by gut, I traced Amos's steps as he ran from the Rose Farm field through a wooded ravine, buried, and the name Samuel Gladney jumped out at me. He had been wounded at Cedar Creek. We had found his grave. I'm not sure of his relationship to Amos in real life, possibly a cousin, but I had made him Amos's older brother in my reenacting life. It was an emotional discovery. I would love to know if and how the Samuel Gladney that was wounded and eventually died from his wounds at the Battle of Cedar Creek was related to Amos Gladney. Well, Pelham, by now you have to be getting tired of reading this. Sorry to drone on. The whole Amos Gladney thing is kind of an obsession with me. His descendants, I'm sure, will think I'm nuts. I can't say that I blame them. It's very real to me, though, and I guess I'll never know for sure until I die again. Because, to quote an old friend, you don't get to see the whole movie until you die. I would greatly appreciate any information at all that they might have about Amos and his family. Could you ask them that if by some miracle, would any of them also have a picture of Amos or Jane? I know that's really reaching for the stars, but it's worth a shot. Also, feel free to give my email address to anyone who may want to get in touch with me. And I've got that here if anybody wants to copy that email address and write to her. And I did look up Amos Gladney in the Red Book and in the Blue Book, and he was definitely killed at the Battle of Manassas, at Gettysburg, sorry, and was a real person.
Yes, I'd just like to say I reported the information that's in the Gladney book on Amos. He was the brother of my great-grandfather, Gladney. And I'll give you a couple of things briefly, and I'd be glad to get the email and give you the details I have. But the mother is not buried with the Gladneys, as I understand it. She, when her husband, Joseph Gladney, died, she remarried and to Mr. Davis, and I think he buried her with the Davises, as I recall. And offhand, I couldn't tell you where. Amos was an orphan with his brother, who was my great-grandfather. The Confederates had recruiting people that were coming around, and so they went here to Monticello, as I recall, and recruited him when he was about 15. And he had the Davises were his guardians at the time, and so they wrote. I understand they wrote to the Confederate cabinet and wanted him discharged because they said he was an heir from a prominent family, and that you know, if the Confederates were going to take their young men off and have them killed before they can mature and contribute as an adult, you know, that this was very bad to the Confederacy. And so a letter was written from the Confederate cabinet. They made a decision in the cabinet and established a policy of when they allowed minors to be discharged for these reasons. And they sent the letter to, well, back to the family, and we had it when when his daughter Jeannie Gladney died. We had the letter from the Confederate cabinet, and it was sold as part of the estate for about $20, as I recall. But anyway, that's what I know.
Excuse me, what was your great-grandfather Gladney's name?
He was
Bunyan.
He was Bunyan Gladney.
Bunyan, not Samuel, Bunyan.
But seems like he had a first name too. It was, but anyway, Bunyan Gladney.
The commanding persons from the Monticello Guards, which was the unit that he joined, was John Bunyan Davis.
Oh, well, let me tell you this. He was discharged. And so the next year, the recruiters from his old unit came back to Monticello, and they told the boys that they were hurting, they really needed the people. He joined up, and he was dead in this battle in about 3 or 4 weeks.
Well, my cousins are descended from the John Bunyan Davis side, so I'm sure there's that connection that brings the Bunyan name into your family. Any comments? Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
For sharing.
As a family, we'd like to make a donation to the museum for your hard work and your protection of our 2 Gladney Bibles that are still there. So please accept the donation.
I'd like to say this is the beginning of a fund to purchase microfilm reading machine for the genealogy room, but it's a $6,000 to $10,000 purchase that I think is pretty far off in the future, but we will make very good use of this with our genealogy room. Thank you so much. Yes, and if anybody wants a copy of that email, this is my email address, but the printer messed up and forgot to put the A on it. You put a dot where the A is, but if you, I'll give it to you. All right, it's Fairfield, you know how to spell that, M-U-S, the first 3 letters of museum, at Truvista, TRUVISTA.net. And my first name is P-E-L-H-A-M, and Lyles is L-Y-L-E-S. This lady, if you would like to write her, her name is Janet Aroni, and her email address is jarone@hotmail.com. Thank y'all for sharing.
Thank you.
It's always Thank you.
Kathy, while we're on history and so forth, and I want to say one thing. Mr. Ed Stevens' son, Buddy, whom I've spoken to quite a bit, getting this key, and we got to know each other pretty well and visiting, and he was telling me that the area behind his current house, which is right across from the big house that Mr. Ed owned, there's a pond back there, and he's got a friend that lives back there. They have discovered, and he said Mr. Ed told him all this years, that was the Gladney grist mill. And he wants to reestablish the works in that thing, the framing at least. I don't know about the millstones, but so we're gonna partner up and do a little sweat equity on on shopping a little bit of that. I haven't seen it, but I was glad to know that it was there, that was Gladney land all around there, according to Mr. Ed and his history. So,
When you do see
hooray.
it, will you send me a picture?
I will.
Keep us in touch on that too. That's
I will.
something.
I never heard that before.
Well, I guess that's it. If there was one thing I forgot to mention, there are a couple of options that we have for the 2012 reunion. A decision has not been made yet where it's going to be next year, but I'll let you know through the Gladney ground. Is that okay?
Good.
And we're having a short church service. If Ken would lead us tomorrow in the service. Oh, you won't be here tomorrow
Well,
morning.
we probably won't get till Monday, so I can do that.
Oh, good.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. We've got a granddaughter playing in a special early service tomorrow. I beg your pardon. I'll have to, singing. Mother's going to be playing in a special singing, so I would prefer, I think I need to be there for that, kind of. If y'all excuse me, please. There's a lot of people here that have the good Lord's talked to their hearts, it's much more than mine, and they can, there's a lot of good words of wisdom and love that can come, so I will miss it myself, but someone can carry it on.
We'll miss you and Miss Martha.
Someone can carry it on. I need to be off tomorrow on that.
Okay, we will not meet in this building. We don't have the building tomorrow, but we'll meet outside in the parking lot. 8 o'clock. Good? 8:30 better? 8 o'clock.
The earlier the better.
8 o'clock.
It's gonna be in, 4 digits. 4 digits. He didn't get 4 digits.
3?
4.
That'd be over 1,000.
That was some degrees.
It feels like
I almost believe it.
it was 100 degrees today. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
See you next year somewhere.